It's Sketchy. I'm also a doctor, and I'm going to be taking you through the next series of lessons on immunology. Immunology can be kind of a pain in the ass for many students because it's really the definition of alphabet soup. IL-2, TNF-alpha, C3b. I am confused. So, in an effort to make this as painless as possible, we're going to start off nice and simple. We're going to introduce some key cells of the immune system and how they develop from their common stem cell precursor. Think of this like that page at the beginning of the book that introduces all the characters before you really get into the story. And so this is the typical kind of chart that you'd see in a textbook that traces leukocyte progenitor cells to their various terminal differentiation points. But here at Sketchy, we like to make things a little more fun. We're going to teach you this chart by going back in time to when a young poet became king of the immunorealm, and he gave rise to a very important family tree. All right, so let's take it from the big daddy himself. That's right, it's Matt the Poet King, and he represents hematopoietic stem cells. Now, you'll notice he looks like a baby, and that's because he represents sort of the very infantile stages of these cells, right? Every other cell will develop and mature from this hematopoietic stem cell. So these hematopoietic stem cells are immature, undifferentiated cells, and they're produced in the bone marrow, hence why our tapestry here is hanging from this bone. These cells will eventually differentiate. This one hematopoietic stem cell gives rise to erythrocytes and platelets and leukocytes, which is the branch that we're primarily interested in here. So hematopoietic stem cells give rise to two types of progenitor cells, just like our King Matt here gives rise to two branches of his family. On one side, beneath His Majesty, we have the myelar family. We'll use those to symbolize the common myeloid progenitor cells, which will become granulocytes and monocytes. Don't worry, we'll come back to what all of that means. But know that these cells are going to be important during the innate immune response. And again, we'll talk a lot more about innate versus adaptive later on. Anyway, here on the right, we have the lympholet family, and they represent the common lymphoid progenitor cells. They'll turn into natural killer cells or B cells or T cells, and we'll circle back to them in a little bit. All right, so let's go back to the myelars, and first up, we'll draw our first responder. If you've seen a Sketchy lesson before, you might recognize the first responder as our recurring symbol for neutrophils because they're typically the first cell on the scene following an injury. If you haven't seen a Sketchy lesson before, welcome to the show. Anyway, these neutrophils are the most abundant of all the white blood cells in the body, which is another reason we're talking about them first. They're also granulocytes, which means that they have granules that contain a number of proteins. They also have a multilobed nucleus, which is why you might hear them referred to as PMNs, which stands for polymorphonuclear leukocyte. They're actually not the only kind of multilobed nucleated leukocyte, but typically if you hear PMNs, people mean neutrophils. So these neutrophils either stay in the blood or migrate into tissues to target disease-causing pathogens. They track chemical trails and phagocytose them or eat them. It's kind of like this EMT eating his cookie, but probably in reality not quite as delicious. All right, next up we have another polymorphonuclear granulocyte. This is Lady Eosin, and she's our symbol for eosinophils. Lady Eosin is famous for her love of very large hair decorations, like that pink bow, which should remind you of the characteristic bilobate nucleus seen in eosinophils. Eosinophils reside in body tissues, and they have granules that pick up the eosin dye used for light microscopy, which is actually how they got their name. That eosin dye makes them appear pink and kind of spotty, just like the pink polka dots on Lady Eosin's dress. And Lady Eosin's wriggly pet worm should help you remember that eosinophils play a major role in defending the body against parasites, things like helminths. This is because eosinophils produce a protein that specifically targets these types of invaders. She's also sneezing to remind you that eosinophils are involved in the process that causes allergic reactions. All right, facing Lady Eosin, we have her twin brother, Baron Baso, and he's there to help you recall basophils. Just like his sister, the way we've colored him is meant to help you remember his name. Basophils are named basophils because they pick up the basic purpley blue dye that they're stained with. We don't actually know that much about basophils, which is why we've given the Baron this mysterious forelock to obscure most of his face. What we do know is that basophils are also involved with allergic reactions, and particularly chronic ones like asthma. That's why the Baron, like his sister, is a big sneezer. All right, last in this first group, we have the royal family's master beekeeper, and he's there to symbolize mast cells. Mast cells mature in the blood, but then take up permanent residence in body tissues like mucosa or in the skin. In response to allergens, mast cells release histamine, and that's symbolized by our recurring symbol of bees. Hence why the mast cell is a master beekeeper. All right, before we move on to the next cell, let's just take a quick pause here and we'll check out a feature that connects all of these 4 cells that we've talked about so far, and that's granules. Neutrophils, eosinophils, basophils, and mast cells all develop granules during maturation. That's why they're called granulocytes. And to symbolize this idea of granulocytes, we've surrounded these 4 cells with this sort of holy granulated parchment. Every other cell that we're going to talk about from this point onward is an agranulocyte because they have no observable granules. All right, back to our family tree. The last miler sibling is Lord Looksee here. He's got a powerful gaze and a totally reasonably sized monocle that nobody else talks about behind his back, I'm sure. This guy and his monocle represent monocytes, innate immune cells that circulate in the blood for a while, but eventually make their way into semi-solid tissues where they differentiate either into macrophages or dendritic cells. Basically, this guy settled down and had a couple of kids. And his firstborn, or the first one we're going to talk about anyway, is the macrophage. The macrophage is represented by our macrophage cage, and again, that's something you'll see throughout Sketchy. This little explorer likes to put anything and everything he finds into his cage. And that's because, just like neutrophils, macrophages are phagocytes, which is exactly why our recurring symbol for the macrophage is a cage. It's the perfect item to trap pathogens and birds and whatever else he comes across. And it rhymes. It's a perfect symbol. Macrophages develop from monocytes in all types of body tissue, which we'll indicate here with this cage's tissue cover. So one gently annoying thing about macrophages is that they can be named differently depending on which tissue type they're found in. But wherever they are, their role is the same, to digest pathogens and signal other immune cells to help fight off infection. With all the cell-to-cell communication macrophages do, it's no wonder he's got a parrot in that cage, a chatty little parrot who talks to other cells. And speaking of talking to other cells, let's meet his sister, the other child of our monocle-wearing Lord Looksee. We'll call her Dendrilox. She represents dendritic cells, which is another type of mature innate immune cell derived from monocytes. Mature dendritic cells have many extending folds in their cell membranes, and that gives them a sort of finger-like appearance, or maybe snake-like, like this little girl's hair. And do you see how her snake hairdo actually extends beyond the frame of her portrait? Those far-reaching tendrils are there to help you remember that dendritic cells reside in environment-facing tissues that interact with the outside world. That's why she's spreading outside of the bounds of her portrait. These cells exist in the skin, the nose, the lungs, the stomach, intestines, anywhere your body sort of interacts with the outside. Like macrophages, dendritic cells are phagocytic communicators. They ingest pathogens and then show the antigens that they recover to activate cells of the adaptive immune system. That's the other reason that these snakes are reaching across the tear that's divided this royal family in half. All right, so let's get into a little family drama and talk about the other side of the family, the lymphulates. So, as I mentioned, baby Matt the Poet King can also differentiate into lymphoid progenitor cells, and those in turn turn into lymphocytes. Lymphocytes are involved in both the innate and the adaptive immune responses. So we'll start with the only innate immune cell of the lymphoid lineage. She might look evil, but don't worry, she's on our side. This not-so-friendly neighborhood assassin represents natural killer cells, or NK cells. So I think whoever named these cells should be put in charge of naming everything in medicine, because for once, they do exactly what their name suggests. They induce apoptosis, or cell death, of abnormal cells, like those infected by a virus. Because NK cells target abnormal cells in general, they're part of the innate immune system. So last but not least, let's turn our attention to the cells of the adaptive immune system. And what illustrious royal family would be complete without some archers? that's actually pretty convenient for us because archers are our recurring symbol for B cells with their B-shaped bows. Conveniently, B cells mature in bone marrow. Nice BB thing going on there. But when they leave the bone marrow, they're still considered naive, which means they have yet to be exposed to a pathogen. B cells aren't considered activated until they've been exposed to a pathogen, and we'll talk about that process a whole lot in later lessons. For now, we'll just say that once they encounter a pathogen, they can differentiate into one of two types of cells, either plasma cells or memory B cells. And these two cells serve slightly different purposes. Plasma cells pump out large amount of antibodies. They're like little antibody factories. And this person with a quiver holding a ton of antibody arrows represents plasma cells. Then activated B cells can also develop into memory B cells, and those do, again, exactly what it says on the box. They retain information about pathogen exposures to help you mount a faster immune response the next time you see that pathogen. So we'll have this wise old elf queen with her antibody hair clips as our symbol for memory B cells. And finally, our tale concludes with the final branch of King Matt's family. We've got this powerful knight and his friendly-looking little squire sneaking into the picture there. This pair represents T cells. T cells are the other main kind of lymphocyte, and like B cells, they're produced in the bone marrow. But because they mature in the thymus, they get the name T cells. After migrating to the thymus from the bone marrow, immature T cells differentiate into several distinct types of T cells. And we've shown the two major types here. First, we've got our fearsome knight with his 8-shaped serpent emblazoned armor, and that's the cytotoxic T cell, which is also called a CD8 positive T cell. Cytotoxic T cells destroy abnormal body cells, and particularly those infected by a virus, but cancer cells and just generally damaged cells are also targeted by CD8 positive T cells. And then there's his cute little helper. This helper squire with his 4-shaped straps represents helper T cells, or CD4 positive cells. Helper T cells help coordinate the immune response. They liaise between B cells and T cells and other cells of the innate immune system. So while cytotoxic and helper T cells are the two major T cell subtypes, they're not the only ones. Regulatory T cells play a huge role in immunity too, but we'll get more into those details in a later sketch. All right, that's one heck of a family tree, and I know we talked about a lot of characters, but don't worry, you'll see all these faces again and again until they probably haunt your dreams, so sorry in advance. And just to get that process started, let's go over these immune cell lineages one more time. All immune cells, or leukocytes, start in the bone marrow as hematopoietic stem cells. These can differentiate into either common myeloid or lymphoid progenitor cells. Myeloid-derived immune cells are all part of the innate immune system. And a large number of them are classified as granulocytes, such as neutrophils, eosinophils, basophils, and mast cells. Neutrophils are the first line of defense and perform phagocytosis. Eosinophils respond to parasitic infections and are involved in allergic reactions, as are basophils. Mast cells are also involved in allergic reactions and release histamine. Monocytes initially circulate in the blood, but eventually make their way into tissues where they differentiate into macrophages and dendritic cells. These two cells both communicate essential information about pathogens to the adaptive immune system. Lymphoid-derived cells, or lymphocytes, can function in either the innate or adaptive immune system. Natural killer cells are innate immune cells that target abnormal cells for destruction via the induction of apoptosis. B and T lymphocytes are adaptive lymphoid cells and are able to be super specific to a particular pathogen. B cells mature in the bone marrow and differentiate into antibody-secreting plasma cells or memory B cells. T cells mature in the thymus and destroy infected cells or coordinate and control immune responses. CD8 positive cytotoxic T cells and CD4 positive helper T cells are the two main types of T cells. And that's it for this stately sketch of Matt the Poet's family tree. Just remember, in the game of germinal zones, you either win or you die. Wait, is that too real for an immune system sketch? Hey there, I'm Ben, and